A week before the wedding, my fiancé announced, "We're breaking up. I'm going back to Jake. Thanks for everything." I said, "You're welcome." That night, I froze her cards, changed the locks, and took back the $15,000 ring. A week later, she was crying at the bottom of my stairs, begging to be let in. When I opened the door, a week before the wedding, my life was moving in checklists and invoices. I was not thinking in emotions or symbols. I was thinking in delivery windows, final payments, seating charts, and phone calls that started early and ended late. Every day that week felt compressed, as if time had decided to rush me towards something I had already committed to without question. The house was quiet that afternoon. Too quiet for a place that had been filled with boxes, garment bags, and half-open drawers for months. I was standing in the kitchen with my laptop open, reviewing the final balance for the venue. The number was large, but it was familiar. I had planned for it. I always planned. Sophie came home earlier than expected. I heard the door, then her footsteps, slower than usual. She did not call my name. She did not ask what I was working on. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me in a way that felt observational rather than affectionate. She said we needed to talk. The words landed flat. Not dramatic, not urgent. Just administrative, like everything else in our lives had become during the last stretch of planning. I closed the laptop because that felt polite. I expected a discussion about guest drama or last-minute changes. Instead, she told me the wedding was off. She did not cry. She did not hesitate. She explained that she was going back to someone from her past, someone she described as unfinished business rather than a mistake. She said the name casually, as if I should recognize its weight immediately. Connor Hale, an ex from years ago who had recently reappeared, successful, confident, and apparently ready to reclaim what he once had. She framed it as clarity. She said the timing was unfortunate but necessary. She said she did not want to live with regret. I listened. I did not interrupt. I noticed details instead. The way she leaned against the counter instead of sitting down. The way she spoke as if delivering prepared remarks. The way she avoided words like apology or responsibility. She thanked me for everything I had done for her. The support, the stability, the opportunities. She said she hoped I would understand eventually. I said you were welcome. I meant it. Not in the way she expected, but in the way that comes from finality rather than bitterness. I did not argue. I did not negotiate. I did not ask her to reconsider. I told her she was free to go. That response seemed to confuse her more than anger would have. She paused, as if waiting for a second phase that never came. She asked about logistics instead. How much time she had. When she could come back for her things. Whether we could talk again once things settled. I told her we would handle it properly. She packed a small bag and left that evening. She did not take much, only what she thought she would need for a few days. She assumed the rest would wait for her. After the door closed, I stood in the same spot for several minutes. Not frozen, not shocked. Just recalibrating. There is a moment after a structural failure when the building does not collapse immediately. That was where I was. Then I started moving. I opened my phone and called the bank. I separated every shared account. I froze every card tied to my name. The representative asked if there was fraud involved. I said yes, because misrepresentation is a form of fraud, even when it wears a familiar face. I logged into the insurance portal and flagged the engagement ring. $15,000, appraised, documented, and insured under my policy alone. I scheduled its retrieval the next morning. I contacted the locksmith and scheduled a same-day rekey. The house was mine, purchased years before I met Sophie, and the deed reflected that clearly. I had added her to nothing permanent. I emailed the wedding planner and placed all services on hold pending review. I canceled the honeymoon reservations. I documented every transaction, every confirmation, every timestamp. Not out of spite, but because clarity matters when stories begin to change. Later that night, my phone started lighting up. At first, it was Sophie. Short messages. Confused messages. Then increasingly irritated ones. She asked why her card was not working. She asked why she could not access the shared savings account. She asked if something was wrong with the system. I did not respond immediately. I finished what I was doing. I changed passwords. I updated security questions. I forwarded my mail to a digital lockbox. When I finally replied, I kept it factual. I told her the accounts had been separated. I told her the ring was being retrieved. I told her we would communicate through email going forward regarding belongings and outstanding obligations. Her tone shifted after that. The messages became sharper. Accusations replaced questions. She said I was being unfair. She said I was acting out of emotion. I found that interesting, because emotion was the only thing I had removed from the process. The next morning, I met with the insurance representative. The ring was collected without drama. Paperwork was signed. A chapter was closed with signatures rather than speeches. By midday, mutual friends started reaching out. They said Sophie was upset. They said she felt blindsided by how quickly things had changed. They said she did not expect me to cut things off so cleanly. That assumption said more than anything else she had told me. By evening, I heard through indirect channels that Sophie had moved in with Connor, that she was excited, that she believed everything would stabilize once the shock wore off. I did not interfere. I did not warn her. I did not offer advice. People deserve the freedom to experience the consequences of their decisions without commentary. That night, I slept in my own bed, in my locked house, with my phone on silent. The next day, vendors began calling. Some were confused. Some were irritated. Some were relieved to speak to someone decisive. I clarified which contracts I was still honoring and which had been terminated. I forwarded documents where necessary. I closed loops. By the third day, the narrative had started shifting. Sophie had told people she needed time. Then she told people she had been pushed away. Then she told people she had been left. None of that mattered. What mattered was what existed in writing. On the fourth day, I received an email from Sophie asking to come by the house to pick up more of her things. The tone was different, less confident, less certain. I replied with a list of available dates and times, and the requirement that someone else be present. Boundaries are easier to enforce when they are explicit. That evening, I stood in the living room and looked around. The wedding decorations were still stacked neatly in the corner, unopened. I did not throw them away. I did not destroy anything. I simply acknowledged that they were no longer relevant. A week earlier, I had been preparing to merge my life with someone who saw me as a temporary platform rather than a permanent partner. That realization did not hurt as much as it clarified. When Sophie had said she was going back to Connor, she believed she was closing one door and leaving another open. She did not realize that some doors close from both sides. The first thing that reached me was not a message from Sophie. It was a call from a florist who sounded tired rather than angry. She asked whether the delivery address had changed or whether the order had been canceled outright. I told her the wedding was canceled and that any further questions should be sent by email. She thanked me and hung up without comment. That set the tone for the week. Quiet, procedural, irreversible. I did not check Sophie's social media. I did not ask mutual friends for updates. Information arrived anyway, the way weather does, carried by people who believed they were helping. Someone said Sophie was glowing. Someone else said she was relieved. Another said she looked exhausted but determined. I listened and kept moving. On the second day after she left, the bank sent me confirmation notices for every account I had separated. On the third, the locksmith emailed photos of the completed work. On the fourth, the insurance payout schedule for the ring arrived. Each message reinforced the same reality. The systems I relied on were functioning as designed. By the fifth day, the first crack appeared. A former coworker of Sophie's sent me a short note asking whether I had moved out. I replied that I had not. He apologized for bothering me and said he had heard conflicting stories. I did not ask what they were. Conflicting stories only matter when they can still change something. That afternoon, I received an invoice forwarded by mistake. It was addressed to Sophie, not me, and it was overdue. The venue deposit she had personally signed for, believing it would be covered by my final payment, had bounced back to her when I placed everything on hold. The amount was not small. The deadline had passed. I did nothing with the information. It was not mine to fix. 2 days later, Sophie's mother called me. I let it go to voicemail. She sounded worried rather than angry. She asked whether we could talk, whether something could be worked out, whether there had been a misunderstanding. I did not return the call. Understanding does not change ownership. The collapse did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one stripping away an assumption Sophie had built her exit on. From what filtered back to me, her arrival at Connor's place had been dramatic but short-lived. He lived downtown in a building that advertised amenities rather than space. She moved in with a suitcase and expectations. He moved on with his routine. At first, she told people it was refreshing. No schedules, no plans, no pressure. Then the tone shifted. She mentioned the lack of privacy. She mentioned that he worked late. She mentioned that he did not like discussing the future. By the end of the week, the compliments disappeared entirely. I learned that Connor had never told anyone he was getting back together with Sophie. He introduced her as someone staying temporarily. He did not clear closet space. He did not adjust expenses. He did not remove dating apps from his phone. That detail reached me from someone I barely knew, which meant it was already common knowledge. On the seventh day, Sophie tried to access one of the credit cards again. The notification came to my phone, declined as expected. This time, the message that followed was longer, less controlled. She said she was in a bind. She said she needed help temporarily. She said Connor had promised support, but things were complicated. I did not respond. That night, I slept poorly for the first time since the breakup, not because of guilt, but because my phone kept buzzing with unknown numbers. I silenced it and went back to sleep. The next morning, a mutual friend called and asked if I had spoken to Sophie recently. He said she was not doing well. He said Connor had asked her to contribute to rent and groceries. And when she said she was waiting for funds to clear, he laughed. He said she accused him of using her. He said Connor told her she had misunderstood what they were doing. That misunderstanding ended with raised voices and a deadline. Sophie left his apartment that evening with the same suitcase she had arrived with. She did not have a backup plan. She had assumed I was the backup plan. She tried calling me again that night. I watched the screen light up and go dark. I did not answer. By the next morning, she had started reaching out to people we both knew, asking for places to stay. Some offered couches. Some offered sympathy without space. Some did not respond at all. Stability evaporates quickly when it turns out to be borrowed. On the 10th day, I received an email from a lawyer's office I did not recognize. It was vague and exploratory, asking whether I would be open to discussing an amicable resolution regarding shared obligations. I replied once, attaching copies of the deed, the account separation confirmations, and the insurance documentation. I asked them to clarify what obligations they believed were shared. They never replied. The same day, a package arrived at my door. Inside were items Sophie had taken with her in a hurry and now did not want to keep. A scarf, a book, a framed photo of us from a trip years ago. No note, no return address. I put the box in the garage. The turning point came on the 12th day. I was finishing a call when the security camera notification appeared on my phone. It showed Sophie standing at the edge of my property, not approaching the door, not leaving. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but structurally, as if something essential had been removed. She did not knock. She did not ring the bell. She stood there, checked her phone, and sat down on the bottom step. I did not go to the door. Not yet. Through the camera, I watched her shoulders sag. I watched her wipe her face with the back of her hand. I watched her type, delete, and type again. Minutes passed. Then someone walked by and glanced at her, recognized her, and kept going. I muted the feed and went back to what I was doing. Not because I did not care, but because timing matters. Once a boundary is crossed too easily, it becomes theoretical. An hour later, she was still there. That was when I opened the door. I did not invite her in. I did not step outside. I stood in the doorway, occupying the space between past and present. She looked up and started talking immediately. Not accusations. Not anger. Explanation. She said things had spiraled. She said Connor was not who she thought he was. She said she had made a mistake under pressure. I listened. She said she needed time. She said she needed stability. She said she had nowhere else to go. I told her we could talk about logistics another day. She asked whether she could come inside, just to sit, just to breathe. I said no. That was when the panic surfaced. Not loud, not dramatic, controlled but brittle. She asked what she was supposed to do. I told her the truth, that she had options, but none of them involved me fixing what she had chosen to break. That I would coordinate times for her to retrieve the rest of her belongings. That financial matters should go through email. That emotional appeals were not productive. She asked whether I still cared. I told her that caring does not require access. She sat there for a long time after that. I closed the door gently, not to punish, but to conclude the interaction. From inside, I heard nothing. No shouting, no knocking, just the sound of someone sitting with the outcome of their own decisions. Later that night, the security camera showed her leaving. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid the ground might give way beneath her. The next morning, messages started circulating again. People said I was being cold. People said I was being strong. People said different things depending on what they needed to believe. None of it mattered. What mattered was that Sophie had finally reached the point she had assumed would never arrive. The moment when the exit door closed, the backup door locked, and the illusion of control disappeared. She had not lost everything yet, but she had lost the assumption that someone else would always catch her. The morning after Sophie left my steps, the house felt heavier than usual. Not emotionally, physically, as if the structure itself remembered what had happened at its threshold and was holding the memory in its walls. I went through my routine anyway. Coffee, emails, a call with a contractor. Ordinary things have a way of restoring proportion when life tries to distort it. By mid-morning, messages resumed. Not from Sophie directly at first, but from the people orbiting her situation. Someone asked whether I would consider mediation. Someone else suggested we meet to clear the air. Another implied that refusing contact was unnecessarily harsh. I did not respond to any of it. Harshness implies excess. What I was doing was reduction. At noon, I received an email from Sophie. It was longer than the others. Measured, carefully structured. She acknowledged her decision. She admitted she had underestimated the consequences. She said she was not asking for forgiveness, only for a conversation. I replied with a time and date for a belongings pickup and a reminder that a third party needed to be present. Nothing more. An hour later, she asked if we could talk sooner. I declined. The afternoon passed quietly. I worked from home that day, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be present for whatever came next. Experience has taught me that unresolved situations tend to arrive unannounced. It was just after sunset when the camera notification appeared again. This time, Sophie was not alone. She stood at the bottom of the stairs with her mother beside her. Her mother looked composed in the way people do when they believe composure can negotiate outcomes. Sophie looked hollowed out, like someone who had run out of internal arguments. I did not open the door immediately. I watched them speak to each other. I watched Sophie gesture toward the house. I watched her mother nod. Then the bell rang. I waited a full minute before opening the door. Not out of cruelty, but because silence clarifies intention. When I opened it, I positioned myself the same way as before. Inside the frame, blocking entry, neutral posture, calm expression. Her mother spoke first. She said she hoped we could resolve things peacefully. She said emotions had run high. She said Sophie was struggling and needed support. I listened. She said family helps family. She said Sophie had invested years into the relationship. She said it was unfair for everything to collapse so suddenly. I let her finish. I explained, calmly and without embellishment, that Sophie had ended the relationship, that the timeline was not sudden from my side, that support does not obligate access, that legal and financial matters were already documented and closed. Her mother shifted then. She tried a different approach. She said Sophie had acted impulsively. She said people make mistakes under pressure. She said forgiveness was a sign of strength. I told her that forgiveness is internal and reconciliation is logistical, and I was not offering the latter. Sophie stood quietly during this exchange. She did not interrupt. She did not contradict. That alone told me how far things had progressed. Her mother asked whether Sophie could at least come inside to talk privately. I said no. That was the moment the tone changed. Sophie finally spoke, her voice steady but thin. She said she had not expected things to escalate this far. She said she believed I would be hurt, angry, reactive. She said she did not expect silence. I told her silence is often the most accurate response when there is nothing left to negotiate. She asked what she was supposed to do now. I told her the truth, that she would have to build something new without assuming someone else would subsidize the transition. That discomfort was not danger. That losing convenience is not the same as losing dignity. Her mother looked at her sharply then, as if hearing parts of the story for the first time. She asked Sophie whether everything I said was accurate. Sophie nodded. That nod did more than any argument could have. Her mother's posture changed. The certainty softened. The authority drained slightly. She asked about the ring. I told her it had been reclaimed. She asked about the house. I told her Sophie had never been on the deed. She asked about money. I told her accounts had been separated the day Sophie left. Nothing I said was new. It was simply the first time it had been presented without distortion. Her mother exhaled and said she wished she had known sooner. I did not respond. Wishing does not alter paperwork. Sophie asked if we could walk, just around the block, just to talk like adults. She framed it as closure. I told her closure does not require proximity. That was when the last card was played. She said she had nowhere to stay that night. She said couches were running out. She said her mother lived too far away to drive back safely. She said she needed one night to stabilize. I considered it, not emotionally, but structurally. One night becomes two. Two becomes a week. Boundaries erode quietly when they are justified as exceptions. I declined. Her mother looked surprised. Not angry, just surprised. I offered a practical alternative. I suggested a nearby hotel. I said I would coordinate the belongings pickup for the following week. I said communication should remain in writing. Sophie looked at the stairs behind me then. The same stairs she had sat on the night before. The same stairs that marked the edge of what she had lost. Her mother took her arm and guided her away. Not forcefully, decisively. I closed the door and locked it. Inside, the house was quiet again, but this time it felt settled, as if the structure had finally accepted the reality it had been bracing for. The next day, the narrative outside intensified. I was described as cold, calculated, heartless. I was also described as composed, disciplined, unyielding. People project according to their own fears. I did not correct anyone. On the third day after the stairs incident, Sophie sent one final email. Short, direct. She acknowledged that returning was not an option. She asked only for confirmation of the belongings pickup date. I confirmed it. The pickup itself was uneventful. Sophie arrived with a friend I did not recognize. They moved through the house quickly, efficiently, avoiding eye contact. I stayed in my office and let them work. When they left, the house felt lighter. Not relieved. Cleared. That night, I reviewed the remaining wedding assets. Decorations, favors, printed materials. I boxed them neatly. Some would be returned. Some would be donated. None would be destroyed. Destruction suggests unresolved emotion. I had none. By the end of the week, the The story everyone else was telling had reached its peak. Sophie had been wronged. Sophie had been humbled. Sophie had been exposed. Depending on who was speaking, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that the stairs were empty. The door was closed. And the space she once occupied in my life had been reclaimed not by anger, but by absence. After Sophie's belongings were removed, the house returned to a version of itself that felt older and more stable. Not happier. Not triumphant. Simply accurate. Rooms returned to their original purposes. Closets regained space. Drawers closed without resistance. There was no moment of celebration because nothing had been won. Something unfinished had been corrected. The practical consequences continued quietly. The wedding planner confirmed final cancellations and partial refunds. Some deposits were non-recoverable. Those losses were documented and absorbed without protest. Money can be replaced. Confusion costs more. I redirected what remained towards settling outstanding balances and closing accounts that had existed only for an event that would never happen. The ring was sold through the insurer's recommended channel. The amount recovered was lower than its appraised value, but still substantial. I did not spend the money immediately. I placed it in a separate account and left it untouched for weeks. Large transitions deserve pauses. Sophie's situation deteriorated more publicly after that. The overdue invoice from the venue became a collection issue. The amount was not catastrophic, but it was enough to disrupt her credit. She attempted to dispute it, claiming misunderstanding, but the contract bore her signature. That detail mattered. Her employment status also became unstable. She had taken time off assuming a wedding and honeymoon would follow. When those plans vanished, so did the justification for her absence. She returned to work distracted, defensive, and emotionally erratic. That description did not come from me. It came from people who noticed patterns and connected them. Within a month, she was placed on a performance review. Connor never reappeared in her narrative. His absence became conspicuous. People asked questions she could not answer convincingly. Stories require continuity to survive scrutiny. Hers did not have it. Her mother reached out once more, not to negotiate, but to ask whether I would be willing to provide documentation confirming the separation of finances for Sophie's records. I sent the documents the same day, not out of goodwill, but because accuracy benefits everyone. After that, contact ceased entirely. My own life adjusted in ways that felt almost anticlimactic. Friends recalibrated. Some apologized for assumptions they had made. Some avoided the subject entirely. I accepted both responses without comment. People behave according to their own internal pressures. It is rarely personal. I returned wedding items that could be returned. I donated what could not. I canceled subscriptions and services that had been tied to shared routines. I changed my emergency contact information. I removed Sophie's name from places she no longer belonged. None of it was dramatic. It was administrative. The emotional residue arrived later, not as grief, but as clarity. Patterns that had been ignored became obvious in hindsight. Decisions that had seemed mutual revealed their asymmetry. I realized how often I had been the stabilizing factor while assuming stability was shared. That realization did not produce anger. It produced adjustment. 3 months after the breakup, I ran into Sophie unexpectedly at a grocery store across town. The encounter lasted less than a minute. She looked thinner, not unhealthy, just worn. She hesitated, then nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact rather than a person. I nodded back. We did not speak. That silence said more than any conversation could have. Later, I learned she had moved into a smaller apartment with a roommate she barely knew. That her social circle had contracted. That she spoke less about the breakup and more about starting over. The phrase was vague, which suggested the foundation was still forming. Her mother told a mutual acquaintance that Sophie had learned a hard lesson about independence. The word independence was used carefully, as if it were both an aspiration and a warning. I did not comment. My own reputation shifted subtly. Some people viewed my actions as severe. Others saw them as necessary. What surprised me most was how many people approached me privately to say they wished they had enforced boundaries sooner in their own lives. Boundaries are uncomfortable because they remove ambiguity. Ambiguity benefits those who rely on it. 6 months later, I sold the house. Not because it held bad memories, but because it no longer fit the life I was building. I relocated closer to work, downsized intentionally, and simplified routines that had grown bloated during years of accommodation. The proceeds from the sale funded investments rather than indulgences. I did not buy anything symbolic. No cars. No trips meant to signal recovery. Recovery does not require an audience. Sophie's name stopped appearing in conversations entirely by the end of the year. That disappearance felt final in a way confrontations never do. Stories fade when they no longer serve anyone's identity. The last piece of consequence arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. A mutual acquaintance forwarded me an article about a local financial counseling program Sophie had enrolled in. It was framed positively, focusing on rebuilding credit and managing independence. Her name was mentioned once, without context. No scandal, no redemption arc, just participation. That felt appropriate. People often expect endings to be loud or punishing. They expect someone to be crushed or humiliated publicly. Real consequences rarely work that way. They unfold over time, through routines, through adjustments, through the absence of safety nets that were never guaranteed. Sophie did not lose everything overnight. She lost assumptions. She lost leverage. She lost the belief that decisions could be reversed without cost. I did not gain anything dramatic. I gained alignment. My actions matched my values. My environment matched my intentions. When I think back to the moment she said she was leaving, the part that stands out is not the betrayal. It is the certainty in her voice. The belief that she was moving towards something better without sacrificing what she was leaving behind. That belief did not survive contact with reality. The stairs at my old house were replaced by a different set in my new place. Narrower, less polished, entirely mine. Sometimes I think about how she sat on those steps, waiting for something to open that no longer existed. I do not feel satisfaction about that memory. I feel closure, not because she suffered, but because I did not.
I was, just a rookie, and it really made me grow up really fast. And I think being responsible for a whole, not only for yourself, but for other people. And I think that it also is kind of where if someone says, no, you're talking to the wrong person, one of my life mottos kind of was born when I was a flight attendant, because I was so disappointed when I got my kind of marching orders from American Airlines. When you graduate, they tell you where you're going to be based. And I was really hoping for Los Angeles. And they kind of looked at me like, you're never going to Los Angeles. That would take you years to be able to build up that kind of seniority where you can go to Los Angeles.